A mountain in the Nevada desert. The opening of the tunnel is barely visible, a black seam in the rock, half swallowed by sagebrush and silence. Behind that seam, 4 miles of tunnel run straight into the heart of a mountain that once produced more silver than anywhere else on Earth. In 1879, the man who built this tunnel walked away richer than he had ever imagined. The banker who fought him hardest was already 4 years dead, ruined and drowned before the tunnel was even finished. And within 2 years of that sale, most of the mines this tunnel was built to save were already dying. This is the story of the Sutro Tunnel, of the fortune it made, the empire it helped bury, and the man who got out at exactly the right moment. The records don't lie, but sometimes they tell a very different story than the one expected. In the 1850s, a prospector named Henry Comstock was working a claim in what was then Utah Territory, in a stretch of high desert that would soon become Nevada. In 1859, word spread that there was silver under Mount Davidson, a vein so vast it was the greatest precious metal discovery since the California gold rush a decade earlier. It was named after him, the Comstock Lode. Henry Comstock never got rich from it. He sold his share of the claim for a modest profit, and within a few years he had gone broke and taken his own life. It was the first lesson the mountain would teach, and not the last. Discovering the silver and keeping the silver were two very different things. Within a few years, Virginia City grew from a scattering of tents into one of the richest boom towns in America. Extracting the silver required an industry of its own, mills running the Washoe process, in which crushed ore was mixed with mercury in massive amalgamating pans to separate out the precious metal. It was brutal, toxic work, and it made fortunes for the men who owned the mills, not just the men who owned the claims. But the mountain that made men rich was also trying to kill them. As shafts went deeper chasing the silver, miners hit something nobody had planned for, a geothermal aquifer that flooded the mines with scalding water faster than any pump could clear it. Shafts already hundreds of feet deep reached heat that could top 100 degrees, air that was thin and foul, water rising by the hour. Then came fire. At the Yellowjacket mine, dozens of miners burned to death underground because there was no way out. No secondary tunnel, no escape route, nothing but the single shaft they had climbed down. That disaster changed everything. A man named Adolph Sutro had been trying to sell an idea for years. Suddenly, the miners themselves were the ones asking for it. Adolph Sutro was a Prussian-born Jewish immigrant, a self-made entrepreneur who had arrived in America in 1848 and eventually made his way to the Comstock. He had run a quartz mill near Dayton, 10 stamps, built in 1861, burned down in 1863, under circumstances nobody could ever quite prove. Some said arson for the insurance money. He was never charged. Sutro moved on. What he moved on to was bigger than any mill. He had watched drainage tunnels work in Europe, and he proposed something nobody in America had built at this scale. A nearly 4-mile adit driven straight from the Carson River Valley into the belly of the Comstock, designed to drain the floodwater and ventilate the mines all at once. It was not a shaft, not a pump. It was a tunnel, bored horizontally through solid mountain, deep enough to undercut every major mine on the Lode, so water would run downhill and out permanently, without a single steam engine straining against it. Sutro pitched the idea to the state legislature in 1864. By 1865, he had his franchise, 50 years to build and operate the tunnel, and a contract that would pay his company $2 for every ton of ore that passed through it. On paper, it was brilliant engineering. In practice, it made him one of the most dangerous men in Nevada to the people who already controlled the Comstock. This is where the story gets its teeth. The mining interests running the Comstock initially supported Sutro's tunnel. Then they turned against it. A project that promised to solve their worst engineering problem should have been welcomed. Instead, it was opposed, because by the mid-1860s, the Comstock was no longer really run by miners, it was run by a bank. The Bank of California, founded in 1864 by financier William Ralston, had spent a decade quietly acquiring the mines, the mills, the timber companies, and the stage lines that fed the entire district. Ralston's inner circle earned a nickname on the Comstock, the Ring. A tunnel that gave miners a second door into the mountain, one Sutro would control, not the Ring, threatened the entire arrangement. Ralston's man on the ground was William Sharon, a former real estate broker installed to run the bank's Nevada operations. Sharon offered failing mining companies loans at rates no competitor could match, and when those companies couldn't repay, the Bank of California simply took the mine. By the time Sutro's tunnel was under serious discussion, Ralston and Sharon effectively controlled the mills that processed the ore, the railroad that moved it, and the credit every mining company on the Comstock depended on to operate. Ralston resisted paying Sutro the royalties his contract entitled him to, and used the bank's leverage over Nevada's mining companies to strangle Sutro's funding at every turn. This was not an engineer fighting nature. This was a man fighting the single most powerful banking cartel in the American West. Sutro did not back down. He went around the Bank of California entirely, raising financing from European investors and British capital markets to keep the project alive while he searched for the money to build it. While Sutro was still fighting for financing, the man who had fought him hardest was building an empire that would collapse even faster than it rose. By the early 1870s, William Ralston was arguably the most powerful private citizen in California. He financed the University of California, San Francisco's theaters, an irrigation scheme for the entire San Joaquin Valley. His crown achievement was the Palace Hotel, an 80-room, million-dollar showcase with some of the first passenger elevators on the West Coast, built to prove San Francisco belonged among the great cities of the world. He spent $5 million building it, nearly all of it borrowed against his own bank. At the same time, Ralston was pouring depositors' money into speculative Comstock mining stock, betting the Lode still held bonanza-grade silver. When those bets began to fail, and rumors of the bank's shaky finances spread through San Francisco, a run began. On August 26, 1875, a day San Franciscans would remember as Black Friday, crowds lined up outside the Bank of California, demanding their deposits. By 2:35 that afternoon, the vault was empty, and the bank closed its doors. The next morning, Ralston's own board of directors summoned him. He was found to owe the bank nearly $5 million, almost its entire capitalization. He signed over everything he owned in a deed of trust, and the board asked for and received his resignation as president. A few hours later, Ralston went for his usual swim in San Francisco Bay. He never returned. When his body was recovered, the recorded cause of death was a stroke, not drowning, though San Franciscans still argued to this day whether it was an accident. The timing bears sitting with. Ralston's bank, the institution that had spent a decade blocking Sutro's tunnel, refusing his royalties, choking off his credit, collapsed, and its president died broke 3 years before the tunnel he had fought so hard to stop was even finished. The ring that once controlled the Comstock was gone before Sutro's project ever reached the mountain it was built to drain. With his fiercest opponent gone, Sutro's tunnel kept moving forward. Groundbreaking had finally taken place in 1869, nearly a decade after Sutro first proposed the idea, and what followed was one of the largest tunneling operations attempted in the United States up to that point. Work crews made up of immigrants from around the world dug and blasted through nearly 4 miles of solid rock, carving a passage roughly 17 feet wide and 20 feet tall in places, with larger chambers built in at intervals along the route. More than 4 million gallons of water a day would eventually flow out through wooden flumes and later iron pipe, while mule-drawn ore carts ran in the opposite direction on rails. Ventilation shafts spaced along the length pulled fresh air down from the surface. In 1873, a young engineer named Arthur DeWint Foote worked the tunnel, part of a crew chasing a fixed point miles away in the dark, correcting for grade and alignment with nothing but survey instruments and nerve. Behind schedule, behind budget, still fighting for every dollar of financing, even after the ring's collapse. It took until July of 1878 for the tunnel to finally connect with the Savage Mine, 9 years after groundbreaking, 19 years after Sutro first proposed the idea, 14 years after William Ralston founded the bank that had tried to stop it, a bank that by then no longer existed in the form that had opposed him. Here is the twist the records actually support, and it's stranger than any conspiracy. By the time the tunnel was finished, many of the Comstock's mines had already been dug deeper than the tunnel itself, meaning it couldn't drain their lowest levels at all. Comstock's silver production had already peaked in 1877, a full year before the tunnel was even complete. Sutro had spent 19 years, survived a decade of opposition from a banking cartel, and poured a fortune in European capital into building a solution to a problem that was already shrinking by the time he finished it. Then, in 1879, Sutro sold his interest in the tunnel at its peak valuation for roughly $5 million, almost the exact sum that had ruined William Ralston 4 years earlier. That same year, former President Ulysses S. Grant took a joyride through the completed tunnel, proof of how famous Sutro's engineering marvel had become, just as its usefulness was already fading. The records don't offer a confession. What they offer is a timeline, and the timeline is damning enough on its own. Sutro walked away with his fortune and reinvested nearly all of it into San Francisco real estate, eventually acquiring roughly 2,000 acres, about 1/12 of the entire city. He'd go on to become mayor of San Francisco in 1894, building the Sutro Baths and Cliff House with Comstock's silver money, while the mountain that made him rich began its long decline. The tunnel kept working for decades after Sutro left it. A 10-stamp mill went up near its mouth in 1900 and ran for at least another decade. The tunnel itself stayed in use for roughly 50 years total before the Comstock's mines finally gave out for good. Then it was left to the desert. The Victorian mansion Sutro built on the hill above the tunnel burned in 1941. The mill burned in 1967. For decades afterward, the tunnel and its remaining buildings sat sealed off from the public, not by conspiracy, but by collapse, neglect, and time, the same forces that had already claimed the banker who once tried to strangle the project in its cradle. That's only changed recently. A nonprofit called Friends of Sutro Tunnel began restoration work in the early 2010s, cleaning up the mule barn, the wood shop, the carriage house, the buildings where miners once picked up their candles and signed in for the day's work. In 2021, the group hired its first site director, who sent drones into the collapsed tunnel. The machines traveled roughly 300 feet in before losing signal, revealing collapsed timber framing, but a passage that still looked structurally sound. A specialized drone has since pushed more than 1,000 feet inside, and the organization is now raising $5 million, almost the exact figure Sutro sold his stake for in 1879, and almost the exact sum that ruined the man who tried to stop him to fully restore and reopen it. The mountain is quiet now. No mule carts, no flumes running 4 million gallons a day, just a black seam in the rock, and volunteers slowly clearing a century and a half of collapse, one timber at a time. Adolph Sutro spent 19 years convincing a state, a federal government, and half of Europe's investors to fund a hole through a mountain, while the banker who tried hardest to stop him built an empire on borrowed money and lost it all in a single afternoon. Sutro got out at the peak. Ralston never got out at all. The timing did the talking, for the tunnel and for the men who fought over it. The records don't lie. They just don't always tell you what you expect to hear.